Welcome back, everybody. In this video, I'm going to be going over how a composite positional tolerance works, and I'm going to be breaking it down segment by segment. So I'll start with an animation just looking at the upper segment, then I'll go to an animation looking at the lower segment, and then finally I'll show an animation of how they work together. I'll also talk a little bit about why you might use a composite positional tolerance zone as opposed to just a multi-segment tolerance zone. So let's start by looking at the drawing. We've got two holes that are 20 millimeters apart. The pattern of two holes is perpendicular to datum feature A, and then centered on datum feature B, and centered on datum feature C. The upper segment has a 2 millimeter tolerance zone, which means that each hole is able to move around within a 2 millimeter diameter that extends across the entire length of the part. And then the lower segment is a 0.1 millimeter tolerance zone that has no datum references. And we'll see what this means in the second video that I'm going to show. So looking at this first video, you can see that the tolerance zones that are 2 millimeters in diameter each and 20 millimeters apart are fixed relative to the part, or in reality are fixed relative to the datums. And the actual features, the actual holes, are able to move relative to one another and twist relative to one another as long as they stay within those tolerance zones. Getting into the second video, you can see that while the tolerance zones are still fixed relative to one another, they're at that fixed 20 millimeter distance from one another, the tolerance zones are able to move freely around the part because they're no longer talking to the datums. And then within those tolerance zones, each actual hole is able to move relative to one another. Finally, getting into the third video, you can see the upper segment has the larger tolerance zones that are fixed relative to the datums, and the lower segment has the smaller tolerance zone that is fixed relative to each other, but not the datums. And this allows a much looser tolerance relative to the datum structure because maybe you don't care where the holes move relative to the datums. Maybe they can move all the way one direction or the other direction, but you want them to be very tightly toleranced to each other. So that's where something like a composite positional tolerance is quite useful. Now you may be saying, well, why would I use a composite positional tolerance zone in this case? It seems much more confusing than two single segment tolerance zones, and it seems to do the same thing. And in this case, I agree, it does do the same thing as two single segment tolerance zones, but perhaps, and I'm going to put another drawing up on screen, perhaps you have a second pattern of holes, and you want each of these two patterns to be very loosely toleranced to the datums, but each of the two patterns amongst themselves needs to be quite precise. So you want the two holes from the first pattern to be very precisely located relative to one another, and the two holes from the second pattern to be precisely located to one another. But you don't need the patterns to be well or precisely located relative to one another. So that's where a composite positional tolerance zone comes in handy, because while the upper segment, they would be treated as a single pattern, in the lower segment, they are each referenced individually. So they no longer are relating to one another in the lower segment. Hopefully this was a clear explanation of a composite positional tolerance zone and how that works. I think a lot of people find it quite confusing, understandably so. But it is important if you're going to be writing one of the GDTP exams to have this sorted out in your head. It will come up probably on the technologist exam, and it certainly comes up on the senior exam. And on that note, I've actually recently put out a practice exam for the GDTP 2009 senior edition of the exam. I think it could be applicable to technologists, but I followed the exam structure for the senior exam. It is a paid exam, it's 70 Canadian dollars, but if you're not interested in paying that full price, feel free to reach out to me on my website. I will send a discount code, and I hope it help someone. It's something that I really wanted when I was studying for the exam, and I was only able to find maybe one or two practice exams online. So I figured I would put one out there because it's something I really wanted. Anyways, have a good one.